it, she had at first a wild, fantastic idea that it contained a tip. Part 5. Ann Veronica's resolve to have things out with her father was not accomplished without difficulty. He was not due from the city until about 6, and so she went and played badminton with the Widgett girls until dinner-time. The atmosphere at dinner was not propitious. Her aunt was blandly amiable above a certain tremulous undertow, and talked as if to a caller about the alarming spread of marigolds that summer at the end of the garden, a sort of yellow peril to all the smaller hardy annuals, while her father brought some papers to the table and presented himself as preoccupied with them. "It really seems as if we shall have to put down marigolds altogether next year," Aunt Molly repeated 3 times, "and do away with marguerites. They seed beyond all reason." Elizabeth, the parlour-maid, kept coming in to hand vegetables whenever there seemed a chance of Ann Veronica asking for an interview. Directly dinner was over, Mr. Stanley, having pretended to linger to smoke, fled suddenly upstairs to petrography, and when Veronica tapped he answered through the locked door, "Go away, V, I'm busy," and made a lapidary's wheel buzz loudly. Breakfast, too, was an impossible occasion. He read the Times with an unusually passionate intentness, and then declared suddenly for the earlier of the 2 trains he used. "I'll come to the station," said Ann Veronica. "I may as well come up by this train." "I may have to run," said her father, with an appeal to his watch. "I'll run too," she volunteered. Instead of which they walked sharply. "I say, Daddy," she began, and was suddenly short of breath. "If it's about that dance project," he said, "it's no good, Veronica. I've made up my mind." "You'll make me look a fool before all my friends." "You shouldn't have made an engagement until you'd consulted your aunt." "I thought I was old enough," she gasped, between laughter and crying. Her father's step quickened to a trot. "I won't have you quarrelling and crying in the avenue," he said. "Stop it. If you've got anything to say, you must say it to your aunt." "But look here, Daddy." He flapped the Times at her with an imperious gesture. "It's settled. You're not to go. You're not to go." "But it's about other things." "I don't care. This isn't the place." "Then may I come to the study tonight, after dinner?" "I'm busy." "It's important. If I can't talk anywhere else, I do want an understanding." Ahead of them walked a gentleman whom it was evident they must at their present pace very speedily overtake. It was Ramage, the occupant of the big house at the end of the avenue. He had recently made Mr. Stanley's acquaintance in the train and shown him 1 or 2 trifling civilities. He was an outside broker, and the proprietor of a financial newspaper. He had come up very rapidly in the last few years, and Mr. Stanley admired and detested him in almost equal measure. It was intolerable to think that he might overhear words and phrases. Mr. Stanley's pace slackened. "You've no right to badger me like this, Veronica," he said. "I can't see what possible benefit can come of discussing things that are settled. If you want advice, your aunt is the person. However, if you must air your opinions... Tonight, then, Daddy." He made an angry but conceivably an assenting noise, and then Ramage glanced back and stopped, saluted elaborately, and waited for them to come up. He was a square-faced man of nearly 50, with iron-grey hair, a mobile, clean-shaven mouth, and rather protuberant black eyes that now scrutinized Ann Veronica. He dressed rather after the fashion of the West End than the City, and affected a cultured urbanity that somehow disconcerted and always annoyed Ann Veronica's father extremely. He did not play golf, but took his exercise on horseback, which was also unsympathetic. "Stuffy these trees make the avenue," said Mr. Stanley as they drew alongside, to account for his own ruffled and heated expression. "They ought to have been lopped in the spring." "There's plenty of time," said Ramage. "Is Miss Stanley coming up with us?" "I go second," she said, "and change at Wimbledon." "We'll all go second," said Ramage, "if we may." Mr. Stanley wanted to object strongly, but as he could not immediately think how to put it, he contented himself with a grunt, and the motion was carried. "How's Mrs. Ramage?" he asked. "Very much as usual," said Ramage. "She finds lying up so much very irksome. But, you see, she has to lie up." The topic of his invalid wife bored him, and he turned at once to Ann Veronica. "And where are you going?" he said. "Are you going on again this winter with that scientific work of yours? It's an instance of heredity, I suppose." For a moment Mr. Stanley almost liked Ramage. "You're a biologist, aren't you?" He began to talk of his own impressions of biology as a commonplace magazine reader who had to get what he could from the monthly reviews, and was glad to meet with any information from nearer the fountainhead. In a little while he and she were talking quite easily and agreeably. They went on talking in the train. It seemed to her father a slight want of deference to him, and he listened and pretended to read the Times. He was struck disagreeably by Ramage's air of gallant consideration and Ann Veronica's self-possessed answers. These things did not harmonize with his conception of the forthcoming, if unavoidable, interview. After all, it came to him suddenly as a harsh discovery that she might be in a sense regarded as a grown-up. He was a man who in all things classified without nuance, and for him there were in the matter of age just two feminine classes, and no more, girls and women. The distinction lay chiefly in the right to pat their heads. But here was a girl. She must be a girl, since she was his daughter and patable, imitating the woman quite remarkably and cleverly. He resumed his listening. She was discussing one of those modern advanced plays with a remarkable, with an extraordinary confidence. His love-making, she remarked, struck me as unconvincing. He seemed too noisy. The full significance of her words did not instantly appear to him. Then it dawned. Good heavens! She was discussing love-making. For a time he heard no more, and stared with stony eyes at a book-wall proclamation in leaded type that filled half a column of the Times that day. Could she understand what she was talking about? Luckily it was a second-class carriage, and the ordinary fellow-travellers were not there. Everybody, he felt, must be listening behind their papers. Of course, girls repeat phrases and opinions of which they cannot possibly understand the meaning. But a middle-aged man like Ramage ought to know better than to draw out a girl, the daughter of a friend and neighbour. Well, after all, he seemed to be turning the subject. Broddick is a heavy man, he was saying, and the main interest of the play was the embezzlement. Thank heaven! Mr. Stanley allowed his paper to drop a little, and scrutinized the hats and brows of their three fellow-travellers. They reached Wimbledon, and Ramage whipped out to hand Miss Stanley to the platform as though she had been a duchess, and she descended as though such attentions from middle-aged but still gallant merchants were a matter of course. Then, as Ramage readjusted himself in a corner, he remarked, "These young people shoot up, Stanley. It seems only yesterday that she was running down the avenue, all hair and legs." Mr. Stanley regarded him through his glasses with something approaching animosity. "Now she's all hat and ideas," he said, with an air of humour. "She seems an unusually clever girl," said Ramage. Mr. Stanley regarded his neighbour's clean-shaven face almost warily. "I'm not sure whether we don't rather overdo all this higher education," he said, with an effect of conveying profound meanings. Part 6. He became quite sure, by a sort of accumulation of reflection as the day wore on. He found his youngest daughter intrusive in his thoughts all through the morning, and still more so in the afternoon. He saw her young and graceful back as she descended from the carriage, severely ignoring him, and recalled a glimpse he had of her face, bright and serene, as his train ran out of Wimbledon. He recalled with exasperating perplexity her clear, matter-of-fact tone as she talked about love-making being unconvincing. He was really very proud of her, and extraordinarily angry and resentful at the innocent and audacious self-reliance that seemed to intimate her sense of absolute independence of him, her absolute security without him. After all, she only looked a woman. She was rash and ignorant, absolutely inexperienced, absolutely. He began to think of speeches, very firm, explicit speeches, he would make. He lunched in the Legal Club in Chancery Lane and met Ogilvy. Daughters were in the air that day. Ogilvy was full of a client's troubles in that matter, a grave and even tragic trouble. He told some of the particulars. "Curious case," said Ogilvy, buttering his bread